In late 2019, the Amorphous Androgynous released a calendar, and this calendar announced the forthcoming Amorphous Androgynous album, Listening Beyond the Head Chakra. And before that, the release of a multi-part single, We Persuade Ourselves We're Immortal. By this point, it was very clear that Amorphous and Ever So Well were completely different projects that happened to feature some of the same musicians. And so this episode is a bit of a standalone for those of you still following Amorphous, because I know there's a lot of FSOL fans who really don't care for the project. So today on Earthbeat Visions, a history of the Amorphous Androgynous, we look at We Persuade Ourselves We Are Immortal. To begin with, the Amorphous Androgynous, a monstrous psychedelic bubble exploding in your mind, presents We Persuade Ourselves We Are Immortal Remixes. Well, there's a ridiculous title if there ever was one. Release date 29th of August 2020, LP, 3rd of September 2020, download, 20th of November 2020, CD. The monstrous psychedelic bubble continues to expand, now taking on board remixes of Amorphous original tracks on this Record Store Day album. The original song, We Persuade Ourselves We're Immortal, had been one of the most highly anticipated tracks from the third, still upcoming, Amorphous Androgynous album, and its announcement as lead single was met with a very welcome response. In December 2019, it was announced that, following the Multipath single, an album of remixes would be released under the Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble name in April 2020. This was revealed on Facebook in the form of a screenshot from a phone conversation between Gaz and Paul Weller. Then COVID happened and the album didn't come out until August. A CD edition followed in November, also packaged with the main album-length single in a slipcase. After being released on the launch day of the Amorphous Bandcamp, both albums were then removed within hours and then were reinstated later in the month. I've no idea why. The LP was reissued without numbered limitation in February 21. A lot of fun was had watching the various online stores try and cope with the fact that the same musicians were releasing two separate albums under two separate aliases on the same day. FSOL's Record Store Day release, Cascade 2020, was listed in several places with this album's cover, and some stores managed to swap the art and titles of the two. Bless their cotton socks and their inability to deal with really complex situations like this. Most of the remixes eschew the vocals of the original for more evocative instrumental versions, making the lack of Peter Hamill on the cover perhaps unsurprising. The guest artists come from a wide range of sources, from Jared Gosling of Amorphous favourites I Monster with his Regal Worm and Cobalt Chapel hauntological 70s psych folk projects, to the mashup collage project Flying White Dots, Future Children's Analog Electronics, and the Exotica of Fila Brasilia, Steve Cobby, and his Sweet Jesus project, as well as a number of psych rock influenced acts. There are also a couple of excerpts of the Multipath single used as linking sections, as well as a version by Amorphous under the name The Amorphous Androgynous, and a mix by Brian under the fitting reworking of his Amorphous engineer named Stoned Freshwaters. All tracks are credited to the remixer rather than Amorphous, with each track given its own title rather than a straightforward remix name. Remarkably, given the broad range of musicians and styles, the album kind of flows brilliantly. Gaz reported on Facebook that some of the artists were asked to rework their tracks somewhat so they would fit in with the album, and further additions were made by Amorphous themselves to help the flow. It sounds as much like two 25-minute tracks as 14 individual pieces by a large number of different musicians and producers, which is a credit to the band for their incredible curation and mixing skills. The Multipath single was originally intended to come out a month before the remix album in March 2020, and despite the heavy Record Store Day delays, still ended up coming out 3 months after it, in November. Ridiculousness aside, this does mean that these remixes were heard before the original track, which is odd. Given that, on the FSOL board in particular, there were quite a lot of us who wanted to hear the original track, I can't say this was the most satisfying way of approaching it, and after an initial listen, I didn't actually play this again until I'd bought and heard the original. The cover art's by Gavin Penn and comes from a large number of paintings he created for not only the Immortal releases, but Listening Beyond the Head Chakra and the 2020 calendar. They're easily the most beautiful cover pictures of any psychedelic era Amorphous release, collaging 70s prog-esque sci-fi airbrush style art with photographs and digital images. The imagery is fitting, with a crumbling hand holding a watch, a Grim Reaper-like figure, twisted faces and other symbolic elements matching the lyrical themes of the original track. Sadly, Gaz decided to overlay them with the usual array of doctor's surgery waiting room notice board word art fonts. The guy is a liability. Someone needs to direct him towards the Graphic Design is My Passion group on Facebook. The album features a jumping and pumping top catalogue number, which is odd for something one would expect to be released on Monstrous Bubble Records. Unlike other FSR digital projects, the Amorphous don't offer any bonus tracks on the CD version. Future Children, The Lutein Bell. As with a lot of tracks on the Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble album, this is a slightly electronic tinged reworking of the track with additional synths and vocals included in the background throughout. Regal Worm versus the Amorphous Androgynous. Gunter and his Evil Soul Sacrifice Orchestra play Black Mass A Go-Go. Oh, you can't beat that for a title, can you? The most obvious example of Amorphous being involved in the remixing process themselves, this reworking by Jared Gosling starts in electronic psych break territory before descending into choral ambience, then heading back into the beats once more for the end. Gosling's always good value, this is one of the better remixes on the album. Cobalt Chapel, High Mortality Part 1. Jared Gosling, again, providing a brief 1-minute interlude for organ, synth and choir. The Amorphous Androgynous, physically I'm here, mentally far, far away. Excerpt. A brief snippet of Physically I'm Here from the main Immortal single. No idea why. Higher Peaks, In Madness Reigns. Amorphous co-producer Enrico Berto's band Higher Peaks provide this chopped up breaks remix. Cobalt Chapel, High Mortality Part 2. Jared Gosling's second Cobalt Chapel offering is an unusual drone piece based around the track's choir elements. Las trompas de fallopium, somos inmortales nos persuadimosi. The wonderfully named Las trompas de fallopium, the fallopian tubes, is a Mexican psychedelic artist whose interpretation of We Persuade Ourselves Are Immortal takes the piece into a fuzzed out psych rock jam. The Stone Vibe is a refreshingly different take on the piece. The track is co-mixed by Yage, presumably Brian. Stoned Freshwaters, everything is easy with a little persuasion. Speaking of Brian, this is presumed to be his remix given his amorphous engineering name of Stoned Freshwaters and its penchant for marijuana. After a long ambient intro, the piece moves into a suitably stoned sounding trip-hop groove with Jared Gosling's keyboard improvisations for good measure. Gaz's vocals are brought to the fore here, giving an idea of what the track might have sounded like had it been recorded, say, for the Isness. Atomic Simao, Gravity Bong. Opening with a chugging breakbeat section, Ukrainian psychedelic outfit Atomic Simao's remix quickly changes tack and switches into a pacey groove with particular emphasis on saxophone. A fun and lively piece. Richard E. Further Out, Our Dominion. There comes a point on this album where it's difficult to really tell which remix is which, and this is possibly it. The American DJ's mix starts in breaks territory before bluntly switching to a folky section with oddly looped vocals and acoustic guitar. This is expanded upon with sitar, tempura and flute from the Amorphous live band, creating a brief but lovely organic section amidst all the craziness. Steve Cobby's Sweet Jesus, The Persuader. Starting with a continuation of Our Dominion's live Amorphous acoustic jam, The Persuader eventually comes into its own with a slow hip-hop groove overlaid with dubby bass and effects, over which elements of the main track play. Amorphous Androgynous, Symphony on a Theme of Mortality, Part 2. A brief alternate section of Symphony on a Theme of Mortality from the main Immortal single, because... The Flying White Dots, Counting Down the Time, Part 2. Brighton-based DJ and mashup artist Brian Wellams provides a lot of additional samples and productions over the course of the album, and also creates this ambient take on the track, which includes the very familiar Amorphous Rooks coring quietly in the background. The Cuckoo Clocks, Tomorrow, Time and Immortality. A jaunty pop-psych take on the Immortal theme from Sheffield band Cuckoo Clocks that closes the album on an enjoyably light note after a run of pretty heavy going stuff. The final mix is by Yage, once again probably Brian. The Amorphous Androgynous and Peter Hamill. We persuade ourselves we are immortal. Release date 20th of November 2020. Okay, so if we ignore the awkward issue of the Persuade themselves are immortal, a remix album coming out months before the main release, then this is the long-awaited return of the Amorphous Androgynous. Other than a couple of brief offcuts given away with the 2020 calendar, the project hadn't released any new music of its own since 2013, and nothing in the way of anything that felt like a conventional album since 2008. And if one counts Gaz's dismissal of the Peppermint Tree as an archive album, then this is the first proper release of new Amorphous material written for its own sake since Alice in Ultraland 15 years before. Either way, it was long awaited by Amorphous fans, especially given that the construction of the lead track itself was documented on Gaz's Facebook from 2015, with him first being seen laying down a bass part in December of that year. Later news included Paul Weller playing piano, Brian Hopper adding saxophone in 2016, Gaz giving us a house tour to the soundtrack of an early Rough mix and recording vocals in 2017, for a bit of a wait until we saw Brian recording some SX1 work and Ray Fenwick's added guitar in 2018. That summer, a string arrangement was demoed and then recorded, the recording session documented over a series of Facebook stories. Synths for the second path were recorded in 2019, suggesting the main track was done and the album-length single was being worked on. Eventually released in November 2020, quite a few months after the initial March release date, and, that's pretty good going by Amorphous standards. The track was very highly anticipated by those who'd followed its construction over the past 5 years. And that wasn't all FSOL fans. Even Brian admitted that at this point there was no problem with clashing releases between Amorphous and FSOL, with the two projects having largely different fan bases at this point, with a small amount of crossover. There's something slightly unusual about this being the first traditionally FSOL multi-part single since the Mellow Hippo Disco Show, while FSOL itself had seemingly given up on the concept as a way of releasing new material. Still, it fits the track, Amorphous very much leaning into its prog side. The original piece is a 12-minute Pink Floyd aping track, with Van der Graaf Generator's Peter Hamill on vocals. Foreshadowing the amount of behind-the-scenes information given about the track's conception, we can also see the very first time Hamill met the band when presenting them with the Mojo Best Compilation Award for Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Pagan Love Vibrations, and the interviews afterwards. Yes, this is the famous lengthy interview where Gaz got shouted, "Get off" and "Encore," based on how long he was ranting on. There's a brief, semi-jokey moment where Gaz suggests maybe they could work together. Little did we know how far that would go. It wasn't until a couple of years later, when hearing Hamill's vocals on Otherworld, his collaborative album with longtime Amorphous friend Garry Lucas, that Gaz realised he would be the ideal vocalist for the work-in-progress track that didn't sound quite right with the usual nasal Cobain vocals. After eventually getting in touch via Jim Christopoulos of the Van der Graaf Generator Facebook page, the two spoke about working together, and after Hamill reacted positively to the track, the collaboration was on. Possibly a less high-profile partner than Gaz's initial hope of involving both Roger Waters and Dave Gilmour. Yeah, good luck with that, Gaz. But a worthwhile one, with Hamill's vocals perfectly suiting the feel of the track. I'm not convinced the multi-part single format is necessarily suited to the song, at least in the Amorphous manner. Whereas the band's 90s singles often only reused a few samples between tracks, Translations, the Mellow Hippo Disco Show, the tracks for the Scrap Divinity single and this are all very much reworkings of the original's main elements, so they're basically remixes. It's quite well structured, with calmer orchestral and ambient sections placed between the original and the two more breaksy tracks, although none of the original tracks works too well in its own right. As a single listening experience, I found it works better when considered as a single 40-minute piece rather than 6 individual tracks. My initial response to the album, focusing on each piece, was actually somewhat negative, but upon receiving the CD and listening to it without trying to think about the index points between the tracks or whatever, I enjoyed it more. The sort of piece that can just about get away with being 40 minutes long, although I do wish there was more variation on it. There's also far too many wailing voices for my taste. Despite his love for vinyl releases, Gaz admitted on Facebook that creating the CD version was a blessing, allowing the full record to play as a single extended suite without gaps. The LP edition swaps 2 tracks around on the B-side, which I didn't notice for quite a while. I originally realised that meant I had to buy a copy just to hear the difference. 4 years later, I've still not actually got around to that. The real takeaway for me has been how much like a real rock band the record sounds, especially on the main track itself. Despite Gaz describing the album as very much studio-based, balancing the best of what we do as sampling collage freakniks with the most liberating musical performances I can inspire, it doesn't really sound like that. With a lot of FSOL albums of the 2010s containing tracks that would previously have been included on the more electronic-leaning Amorphous records, Murmurations, Somnambulant Drift, In Solitude We Released Alone, etc., the album feels like Amorphous finally outing itself as a full-on prog rock band, so to hear Gaz talking about it being based around sampling collage kind of feels a bit odd. It was no doubt put together like that to an extent, without the requirement of limited computing power or the early Akai samplers. There are clearly a lot of very long individual standalone performances included here. Personnel then, there are 47 musicians plus choir credited on the album, which is really quite a lot. Much closer to the everyone we can find and their Uncle 2 approach of the isness than the core jam band sound adopted in the late noughties. The live Amorphous band seemed to have imploded quite dramatically at some point, with only Stu Rowe being left over from that classic lineup, with Gaz's partner Morven Bryce also providing string arrangement, having previously played on the Mellow Hippo Disco show in the late 90s. Later live members Anthony Argyros and Kez Goons are also present, the latter receiving a co-writing credit, with the bulk of the other musicians being new names. Vocalists are unnecessarily split between vocals and female vocals, a completely unneeded distinction recurring throughout Amorphous credits. Still, the elephant in the room is Enrico Berto, who is credited with co-producing and mixing the album. Berto's a long-time FSOL fan, as well as a huge Van de Graaff Generator fan and a professional musician and an engineer to boot. Some controversy arose on the FSOL board, however, through an article on his own website giving a fairly detailed history about meeting Gaz via Paul Weller, creating We Persuade Ourselves We're Immortal, coming up with various ideas for the track, and mixing a whole thing, without a single mention of Brian. If Berto's story is to be believed, the entire track was produced and mixed by him and Gaz alone, with Brian's only performance credit in the album sleeve being for the SX1 arpeggio featured in the piece. There were serious worries that Amorphous had basically become a Gaz project at this point, which was quite an extension of the original open secret that Amorphous has been more of Gaz's project than Brian's, with Brian adding his own more atmospheric pieces at times and generally working on the production and engineering side more. But nobody wants to read a complete stranger talking about working on aspects of the album that should really have been handled by another member of the actual band. And the article does seem to have soured the release a little for quite a few fans. Similarly, Gaz's family and friends are the only people mentioned in the thanks section. 6 months after its release, the album's promotional campaign began, with a mooted streaming and wider digital release announced that never happened, with a few brief news stories and interview snippets, as well as some pretty positive reviews from progressive rock quarters. A YouTube preview even appeared at the time advertising the album. In August 2021, a lengthy interview appeared in Prog Rock magazine. Once again, this garnered a little criticism from fans who'd witnessed a dozen or so new FSOL albums go completely ignored in the previous few years, only for the first new Amorphous single to suddenly get press attention. The YouTube video features a commenter expressing a desire to hear one more FSOL album one day, highlighting just how under the radar FSOL digital releases still are. Gaz did at least point him in the right direction. A further interview quote with Gaz dismissing the previous 15 years of FSOL as a few albums under the radar, and going back to the maybe we'll return to the project again one day line really didn't help. Ultimately, it is a shame that one project flies totally under the radar while the other gets all the attention, especially given that, Gaz's career was built on FSOL. Gavin Penn's artwork is typically brilliant, with a remarkable cover of a tentacle creature appearing from a barely corporeal face floating over a boat sinking into a choppy sea. If you're going to do prog, you might as well go all out and do prog, and the cover is totally fitting. Gaz's centerfold collage in the CD booklet leaves a little more to be desired, especially as it features 6 photos of him and only one of Brian, but we've come to expect that. The booklet features 3 pages of extensive credits and a page of lyrics with more Penn's landscapes in the background, as well as a stunning image of a figure in front of an enormous animal skull in a desert on the booklet's back cover, and as well as the LP's inner sleeve. The font choices are surprisingly tasteful, and overall it's by far the most aesthetically pleasing Amorphous package to date. Amorphous fans tended to respond very positively to the album, with many declaring it to be the project's finest release to date. Detractors seem to have found the record more distasteful than ever, not only lamenting its backwards-looking approach, but its slow, ponderous, possibly bloated sound. Closer to the former camp, although I do sympathise with those who find the progginess stuffy. I do miss the more electronic sound of Amorphous releases, really. That was a great kind of forward-thinking mix of electronica and psychedelia, as opposed to this, which is very clearly aiming to recreate the 1970s. Is that really a worthwhile artistic concern? But I do think the main piece is a good song. We Persuade Ourselves We're Immortal, the third Amorphous prog epic, after Galaxial Pharmaceutical and The World is Full of Plankton, and Listening Beyond the Head Chakra's lead single. Originally a sketch from the noughties, Gaz revisited it in the early 2010s, collaging samples with some guitar playing and lyrics, which weren't going anywhere until a chance recording session with Paul Weller, during which he laid down some grand piano over the piece. This was the spark that led to the track's real development, and the next few years were spent adding various instruments from numerous players. The sessions were punctuated by a period of not feeling very psychedelic after the collapse of the Noel Gallagher sessions. It wasn't until the death of former Amorphous drummer Virgil Howe that the finishing touches were added. The lyrical themes reflect the idea that, in Gaz's words, only by facing and acknowledging our mortality do we fully live. Fitting in context of Howe's death. The track opens with bluesy guitar licks, a striking string chords, some synth bedding, and SX1 gurgles, and eventually Paul Weller's piano chords. After a brief burst of wailing trumpet, the piece fades to near silence from which Peter Hamill's vocals appear. The slow-moving verses, lyrics and melody co-written by Hamill, feature drums, guitar and bass, and lead into Gaz's original bridge and chorus, with backing vocals and strings appearing. After an instrumental break with various solos, the track cuts right back without the rhythm for the second verse, before building up in much the same manner. A dramatic string melody takes over, and then it cuts back to the choir to come in. The track then reaches a climax with choir, strings and Hamill joining forces, and then it's into the outro with a minute of ambient sound, closing on Brian's SX1 arpeggios. It's a dark, dramatic song with weighty themes and a beautiful melody. I think it would work better without the stop-start structure, which always feels like it's on the verge of derailing the track's progress. Having come up with excellent prog epics in The World is Full of Plankton and the Abbey Road version of Galaxial, they clearly know how to structure a piece, so it's unusual to hear everything cutting back to near silence every couple of minutes. Still, it's a good song. High Mortality. The ambient path, a much needed breather after the epic original, High Mortality features layers of SX1 arpeggios, gurgles and sweeps, over which come Ray Fenwick's guitar lines, Alejandro Iglesias' Floyd-like bass, and choir samples. Dave Spears plays analog synth improv over the second half, probably the part of the single most likely to appeal to Amorphous skeptics. The Immortality Break. Chunky funky breakbeat style version, albeit with live drums. Stylistically close to some of the jam tracks on Alice in Ultraland, complete with way too much going on at one time feeling. Very much in the not my kind of thing category. Physically I'm here, mentally far, far away. An orchestral break in proceedings, much in the same manner as the World's in Transience on the Mellow Hippo Disco Show EP. Strings and harp play throughout with saxophone and electric guitar melodies over the top, and Brian's synths in the background. The whole thing cuts back to synths in the middle, before the strings and guitar reappear. Psych Recap, a psychedelic breaks version featuring fuzz guitars, sitar samples, even the gull synth sound from Papua New Guinea. It's the closest thing to Naughty's Amorphous that We Persuade Ourselves Immortal comes, with a touch of something like Elysian Fields maybe to it. With vocals from the main track appearing for the first time on alternate paths, the title is very fitting. Co-producer Enrico Berto seems to have played a significant role here, receiving a co-writing credit as well. The Pink Foil style bass creates a raga-like outro. symphony on a theme of mortality. The epic synth-led finale to the 40-minute version of We Persuade Ourselves We're Immortal, Symphony opens with several minutes of synths and ambience. At 3 minutes, epic electronic drums come in, and the piece moves into proper Vangelis territory with Kendra Frost's wordless vocals giving a very ethereal edge to proceedings. This section could easily fit on an Ever So Well album. Second half moves into slightly different territory, sounding very much like an instrumental reprise of the original, led by Ray Fenwick's guitar improvisation. At this point, Frost's wailing gets a bit much, with layers of her voice filling out the mix. After some bigger sounds, acting as a much needed climax to the album, the piece fades away to a synth outro, and we're done. We Persuade Ourselves We're Immortal and MPB mixes. In line with Environment 6 Plus and Cartel Volume 1 and 2, both of the Immortal releases were released as 2 separate CDs in a card slipcase exclusively through FSOL Digital and the Amorphous Bandcamp. The artwork is based on a small part of the main release's cover. The 2 releases can be purchased together digitally too, at a slight reduction in cost to these separate editions. And that's your lot, and that is the last Amorphous video we'll be having to date. Because despite the album's announcement over 6 years ago, it's apparently not even finished yet. So when we will eventually get a video on listening beyond the head chakra, who knows? Anyway, thank you for joining me with this one-off Amorphous Androgynous special. Drop me a comment down below, like or share. And I'll be back in a few days, carrying on with The Future Sound of London and Humanoid, looking at the first releases of 2021. So I hope you join me for that. Starting with a continuation of our Dominion's live Amorphous Androgynous. A brief alternate section of Symphony on a Theme from Mortality. A brief alternate section of stop giving your track stupid titles, Gaz. Amorphous fans tended to respond very positively to the